King Charles had barely looked up from the sealed document lying in front of him when the atmosphere inside the palace changed in a way that no one could ignore. Every advisor around the table suddenly fell silent. Princess Anne remained perfectly still, and Camilla quietly realised that this meeting was no longer about routine royal duties. It was about authority, not titles, not ceremonies, but the question of who would quietly shape decisions inside the monarchy when difficult moments arrived. What happened next wasn't announced with applause or dramatic speeches. It was revealed through a single instruction that immediately changed the balance inside the royal family. And the most surprising part wasn't that Princess Anne's role appeared to grow. It was why King Charles believed only one person could be trusted with that responsibility, because once that decision was understood, the palace could never return to the way it had been before. King Charles entered the meeting room carrying nothing more than a slim leather folder, yet everyone present immediately sensed that this was not another ordinary discussion about upcoming engagements or ceremonial duties. Inside Buckingham Palace, experience teaches people that the quietest meetings often carry the greatest consequences. Grand announcements are usually reserved for the cameras. The decisions that truly shape the monarchy are often made behind closed doors, where silence carries more weight than applause. This morning felt exactly like one of those moments. The room itself reflected that seriousness. Senior palace advisors had already taken their seats. Constitutional experts sat with neatly organised papers before them. Members of the King's private office exchanged only the briefest glances, careful not to reveal what they might already know. Even those who had attended hundreds of royal meetings admitted later that something about the atmosphere felt unusually heavy, as though everyone understood they were approaching a turning point without yet knowing what form it would take. Then the sealed document was placed at the centre of the polished table. No announcement followed. No explanation came immediately. The king simply rested his hand beside the folder and allowed the silence to settle across the room. That pause mattered because, inside royal life, silence is rarely empty. More often, it gives people time to understand that whatever comes next cannot easily be undone. Princess Anne sat opposite her brother with the same composed expression that had defined decades of public service. She didn't lean forward in anticipation. She didn't search the faces around her for reassurance. She simply waited. Those who have watched Anne throughout her royal career know that restraint has always been one of her greatest strengths. She rarely performs emotion for an audience, and perhaps that is exactly why the palace has trusted her during so many difficult moments. While others speak, Anne observes. While others react, Anne measures. That difference has quietly become one of the defining characteristics of her place within the royal family. King Charles finally broke the silence. He explained that the monarchy was entering a period that demanded greater clarity, stronger internal discipline, and an unmistakable understanding of responsibility. His words sounded measured, almost administrative, but those listening closely understood something more significant beneath the formal language. The king wasn't speaking about public appearances alone. He was speaking about the invisible structure that keeps the institution functioning long after newspaper headlines disappear. That distinction matters. Most people think the monarchy survives because of crowns, ceremonies, and traditions. In reality, it survives because every member understands where responsibility begins and where authority ends. Those boundaries are rarely discussed publicly, yet they determine how every royal engagement, private meeting, and constitutional responsibility is managed behind palace walls. As Charles continued speaking, attention gradually shifted toward Princess Anne. Not because the king mentioned her by name, he hadn't, but because every sentence describing loyalty, discipline, and unwavering service naturally reminded the room of the one royal who had built her entire reputation around exactly those qualities. Anne had spent decades accepting difficult responsibilities without seeking headlines or popularity. She had become known as someone who rarely complained, rarely created controversy, and almost never allowed personal emotion to interfere with public duty. Inside the monarchy, that kind of consistency carries extraordinary value. Prince William listened without interruption. His expression remained calm, but those who know the future king understand that he rarely wastes attention on routine conversations. William has spent years preparing for responsibilities that extend far beyond public ceremonies. He understands better than most that institutions are strengthened not only by public confidence, but also by disciplined leadership behind the scenes. As Charles described the importance of experienced guidance, William gave the smallest nod. It lasted only a second. Yet inside that room, even the smallest gesture carried meaning. It suggested agreement, not excitement, not surprise, agreement. That subtle distinction would become increasingly important as the meeting unfolded. Meanwhile, Camilla remained remarkably composed. She listened carefully as Charles continued outlining the monarchy's future priorities. But there were moments when her attention appeared fixed, less on the king's words than on the growing direction of the conversation itself, because everyone inside the room understood one uncomfortable reality. Whenever discussions begin focusing on responsibility, authority, and institutional oversight, someone inevitably gains greater influence while someone else discovers new limits. The palace rarely describes these moments as victories or defeats. Instead, it calls them adjustments. But adjustments inside the monarchy can quietly reshape relationships that have existed for years. Outside Buckingham Palace, none of this was visible. Tourists continued gathering near the gates. Journalists waited patiently behind security barriers. Television crews prepared for another ordinary day of royal coverage, unaware that the conversation unfolding only a few hundred feet away might soon dominate headlines around the world. Inside the meeting room, however, the atmosphere had changed completely. The leather folder still remained unopened. No names had been announced, no responsibilities had officially changed. And yet everyone present could already sense that the document waiting at the centre of the table contained something capable of quietly redefining the balance inside the royal family. Then King Charles finally reached forward, placed his hand on the seal, and prepared to reveal the one instruction that would leave everyone in the room looking toward Princess Anne. King Charles didn't break the seal immediately. Instead, he allowed his hand to rest on the folder for several long seconds, almost as though he wanted everyone in the room to understand that whatever happened next would carry consequences far beyond the meeting itself. That hesitation mattered because the monarchy has always understood something the public often overlooks. Decisions are rarely measured only by what they change today. They are measured by what they quietly shape years from now. Then, with slow precision, Charles opened the folder. The sound of the seal breaking was almost inaudible, yet inside the room it seemed louder than any announcement. Every advisor lifted their attention toward the document. Every official stopped writing. Even the palace secretary, whose responsibility was simply to record the meeting, paused before placing another word onto the page. The king began reading. He explained that the institution had reached a stage where experience, consistency, and unquestioned discipline were becoming more valuable than ever before. Public confidence, he said, depends not only upon ceremonies seen by millions, but also upon the invisible structure supporting every royal decision behind palace walls. That sentence immediately changed the mood. Because Charles wasn't discussing popularity, he wasn't discussing titles, he wasn't discussing succession, he was discussing trust. And inside a monarchy, trust often carries more weight than rank itself. Princess Anne remained completely still. Those present later remarked that she never once interrupted the king, never attempted to anticipate where his remarks were leading, and never displayed the slightest hint of expectation. Her composure almost became part of the discussion itself. While uncertainty quietly spread around the table, Anne continued listening exactly as she had throughout decades of royal service. That restraint spoke volumes. Some people lead by speaking first, others lead by allowing responsibility to speak for them. Princess Anne has always belonged firmly in the second category. Charles continued. He acknowledged that the royal family had experienced years of significant change. The passing of Queen Elizabeth II, the beginning of a new reign, changing public expectations, and increasing pressure upon senior working royals had created responsibilities that could no longer rest upon one individual alone. That observation felt impossible to ignore. The king wasn't describing a temporary situation. He was describing the future. Around the table, advisors exchanged careful glances without saying a word. Inside palace culture, eye contact often communicates what official language cannot. Everyone seemed to recognise that Charles was preparing the room for an announcement that extended beyond routine administration. Prince William understood it immediately. He had spent years watching his grandmother govern through patience rather than urgency. Queen Elizabeth had often believed that institutions survive because responsibility is distributed wisely rather than concentrated recklessly. William had inherited that philosophy, and as Charles spoke about strengthening the monarchy from within, the Prince of Wales appeared to recognise exactly where the conversation was heading. Not toward personalities, toward structure. That distinction mattered because structure survives individual reigns. Personal relationships do not always. Camilla listened carefully. Nothing about her expression suggested disagreement, yet there were moments when she appeared to study not the document itself, but the reactions unfolding around the room. She understood better than almost anyone that discussions concerning responsibility can quietly redefine influence without ever changing a single royal title. Titles create visibility. Responsibility creates authority. The monarchy has always known the difference. Charles reached another page. He explained that certain responsibilities require individuals whose judgment has been tested repeatedly under pressure. People capable of placing duty before comfort, stability before popularity, and institutional continuity before personal preference. Those qualities described many members of the royal family, but one name naturally stood above the others: Princess Anne. For decades, Anne had accepted hundreds of public engagements every year without seeking attention. She had represented the crown across countless charities, military organisations, international visits, and constitutional ceremonies with remarkable consistency. While public fascination often shifted toward younger generations, Anne quietly continued doing the work that kept the institution functioning day after day. Inside palace circles, reliability had become her reputation. Not excitement, not spectacle, reliability. And reliability is often the rarest form of leadership. One senior advisor slowly folded his hands together. Another adjusted his glasses before looking toward Anne. Neither gesture appeared dramatic, yet together they revealed something important. The room no longer wondered whether Princess Anne would be mentioned. The only remaining question was how far her responsibilities were about to extend. Outside Buckingham Palace, speculation had already begun building. Journalists noticed that several senior officials had entered through private entrances earlier than usual. Royal correspondents started comparing schedules, searching for clues, while television networks prepared special reports, despite having almost no confirmed information. The lack of official details only intensified curiosity. Whenever the palace says very little, observers often assume something significant is taking place. Sometimes they are wrong. Sometimes they are remarkably close. Inside the meeting room, Charles finally looked directly toward his sister. It wasn't a long glance, only a few seconds, but it carried decades of shared history between two people who had spent their entire lives serving the same institution under very different circumstances. There was respect in that look. There was trust, perhaps even gratitude. Because few members of the royal family had carried responsibility as quietly or as consistently as Princess Anne. Then Charles spoke the words that caused several officials to immediately stop taking notes. He announced that certain future responsibilities would require a senior royal whose judgment would be accepted across every level of palace administration, whenever difficult questions demanded immediate guidance. The room became completely silent. Nobody moved, nobody interrupted. Yet one question instantly formed in every mind present. Was the king about to place Princess Anne in a position unlike anything she had held before? Charles lowered his eyes towards the final page of the document, took a slow breath, and prepared to reveal the one responsibility that many inside the palace would later describe as one of the most significant internal decisions of his reign. King Charles allowed the room to remain silent for several moments after reading the final paragraph. It wasn't uncertainty that kept him from speaking. It was significance. Inside the monarchy, the most important decisions are rarely announced with excitement. They are introduced carefully, giving everyone present enough time to understand exactly what is changing before a single reaction can shape the conversation. That pause immediately told the room this was no ordinary administrative adjustment. Then Charles carefully closed the document, not because the discussion had ended, because the explanation was only beginning. The king looked towards the senior advisors gathered around the table and explained that the crown had reached a point where certain responsibilities could no longer depend entirely upon one office or one household. The institution had become too large, too closely watched, and too dependent upon public confidence to allow uncertainty over internal authority. Every future decision, he explained, would require absolute clarity about who carried responsibility whenever questions arose behind palace walls. That statement immediately changed the meaning of everything said before. This was no longer about additional engagements. It was no longer about ceremonial appearances. It had become a discussion about oversight. And oversight inside a monarchy carries extraordinary influence because the individual trusted to oversee difficult situations often shapes how those situations are resolved long before the public ever hears about them. Princess Anne remained exactly as she had been since the meeting began, calm, attentive, completely expressionless. Those present noticed something remarkable. While several advisors quietly shifted in their chairs, Anne never adjusted her posture once. She listened exactly as she had listened throughout decades of royal life, allowing patience rather than emotion to guide every reaction. That consistency mattered. Throughout her public career, Anne had earned a reputation for approaching every responsibility in exactly the same way. Whether addressing international leaders, military organisations, charitable foundations, or constitutional ceremonies. She rarely treated one duty as more important than another, because she understood something Queen Elizabeth, had often demonstrated throughout her reign. The institution survives through consistency, not spectacle. Charles continued speaking. He reminded everyone that royal authority functions through carefully defined responsibilities rather than personal relationships. Family affection remains deeply important, he acknowledged, but constitutional stability requires decisions that can withstand changing circumstances, public pressure, and future generations. The distinction was subtle, yet inside that room, everyone understood it perfectly. Personal loyalty can change. Institutional responsibility cannot. Prince William watched quietly from across the table. His attention never left the king. Those who observed the future monarch closely noticed that William seemed less interested in the announcement itself than in the reasoning behind it. Years spent learning from both Queen Elizabeth and King Charles had taught him that lasting decisions are rarely remembered because of the words used to announce them. They are remembered because of the principles supporting them. That is exactly what Charles appeared determined to establish. One constitutional advisor carefully opened another file. Another official adjusted several pages of briefing notes before placing them back into perfect alignment. Neither man spoke. Neither needed to. Sometimes preparation itself reveals that people already understand where events are heading. Meanwhile, Camilla continued listening with remarkable composure. She had attended enough palace discussions to recognise the language Charles was using. Words like continuity, discipline, institutional clarity, and long-term responsibility have very specific meanings within royal administration. They often signal adjustments that remain invisible to the public, while quietly reshaping how the royal family functions behind closed doors. Most people never notice those changes. The palace certainly doesn't advertise them, yet they often become some of the most important decisions of any reign. Charles slowly turned another page. He explained that certain future matters involving coordination between royal households, ceremonial responsibilities, and institutional guidance would require someone whose judgment carried universal respect across every level of palace administration. Again, he didn't mention a name. He didn't need to. The description itself pointed almost unmistakably toward Princess Anne. Few members of the royal family had earned respect as consistently across government officials, military leaders, charitable organisations, palace staff, and senior advisors. Anne had spent decades building credibility through work rather than publicity. Inside Buckingham Palace, credibility is a form of authority that no title alone can create. One senior palace official finally looked directly toward Anne. Another quietly nodded. The atmosphere became noticeably heavier. Everyone now realised that the conversation had moved beyond theory. It was approaching confirmation. Outside the palace gates, reporters noticed unusual activity. Additional vehicles entered through private entrances. Several members of the King's private office appeared briefly before disappearing back inside the building. Television commentators began discussing whether an important constitutional announcement might soon be approaching, although no official source confirmed anything. Ironically, the absence of information only strengthened public curiosity. Inside the palace, however, curiosity had already been replaced by understanding. Charles finally folded his hands together. His voice remained steady, measured, almost reflective. He acknowledged that every institution eventually reaches moments when experience must become its strongest safeguard. New generations naturally bring new perspectives, but enduring stability often depends upon those who have already demonstrated decades of disciplined service without seeking recognition. As those words settled across the room, every pair of eyes gradually turned toward Princess Anne, not because anyone had instructed them to, because the conclusion now seemed unavoidable. Anne noticed the attention but didn't respond. She neither accepted nor rejected what everyone appeared to anticipate. That reaction alone reminded many people why she had become so respected. Real authority rarely needs to announce itself. It simply exists. King Charles reached for the final page one last time. He looked briefly toward Prince William, then toward Camilla. Finally, his attention returned to Princess Anne. The room became completely still as he prepared to reveal the responsibility that would quietly place Anne at the centre of some of the monarchy's most sensitive internal decisions. King Charles allowed the silence to settle one final time before speaking again. By now, nobody in the room was waiting to discover whether change was coming. They already understood that it was. The only uncertainty remaining was how far that change would reach. Inside the monarchy, responsibilities are rarely expanded without reason. Every adjustment reflects a lesson learned from previous challenges. And every new role is designed not simply to solve today's problems, but to prevent tomorrow's uncertainty. Then Charles spoke the sentence that immediately changed the atmosphere. He explained that whenever sensitive questions involving internal coordination, ceremonial responsibilities, or matters affecting the smooth operation of the royal family required impartial guidance, Princess Anne would serve as the senior point of authority to ensure those responsibilities remained fully aligned with the interests of the crown. The wording sounded formal, almost administrative, yet everyone present immediately understood its deeper meaning. Charles had not elevated Anne through a new title. He had elevated her through trust. And inside Buckingham Palace, trust often carries greater influence than any formal rank. The distinction mattered because titles can attract attention, but confidence from the sovereign shapes how decisions are carried out behind closed doors. Anne wasn't being placed above anyone within the line of succession. She wasn't replacing anyone's constitutional position. Instead, she was becoming the person Charles wanted standing between difficult situations and institutional uncertainty. That role carried enormous weight. Princess Anne listened carefully without interrupting. She neither smiled nor displayed surprise. She simply acknowledged the king's words with the smallest nod before returning her attention to the document resting in front of her. That reaction revealed something important. Some responsibilities are accepted quietly because the people receiving them already understand their burden. Anne had spent her entire life serving the institution. She knew that greater authority never arrives alone. It always arrives carrying greater accountability. Prince William watched the exchange with visible concentration. Those familiar with William's approach to leadership often describe him as someone who pays close attention to systems rather than personalities. While public attention frequently focuses on family relationships, William has increasingly emphasized stability, continuity, and long-term planning. From his perspective, Charles wasn't creating something entirely new. He was strengthening a framework that could continue serving the monarchy well into the future. That understanding explained William's calm expression. He wasn't witnessing a dramatic family moment. He was watching institutional planning unfold exactly as responsible leadership often requires. Around the table, several senior advisors quietly began making notes. One constitutional secretary carefully underlined a paragraph inside his briefing papers. Another official updated the meeting record before sliding the file toward the king's private secretary. Every movement remained measured. Every action suggested that the discussion had now moved beyond possibility. It had become official policy. Camilla remained composed throughout the announcement. She listened with the same calm dignity that had characterized the meeting from the very beginning. Yet those watching closely noticed that her attention remained fixed on Charles rather than Anne. That detail mattered, because Charles had carefully avoided presenting the decision as a question of personalities. Instead, he consistently described it as a matter of institutional confidence. There is an important difference. Personal decisions often create winners and losers. Institutional decisions are designed to create stability. Charles clearly wanted everyone present to understand that distinction. He explained that future generations would inherit not merely a family, but an institution whose effectiveness depends upon clearly defined responsibilities. Every senior royal, regardless of public profile, contributes differently to that mission. Some inspire, some represent, some support, and some quietly safeguard the structure itself. As he spoke those words, the significance of Anne's role became even clearer. She wasn't being asked to become more visible. She was being trusted to become more dependable. Inside the monarchy, those are not always the same thing. Outside Buckingham Palace, speculation was now spreading rapidly. Journalists noticed that the meeting had continued far longer than originally expected. Television presenters interrupted scheduled programming to discuss reports of unusually significant discussions taking place behind palace walls. Royal commentators offered countless theories. Some predicted major constitutional reforms. Others believed senior working royals were preparing for expanded responsibilities. Without official details, every small development seemed to generate another wave of public curiosity. Inside the meeting room, however, the uncertainty had disappeared. Charles slowly closed the folder. He looked toward Anne with the expression of an older brother, who understood both the privilege and the burden he had just placed upon her shoulders. Years earlier, Queen Elizabeth had often relied upon Anne's judgment during periods of intense public pressure. Now Charles appeared determined to continue that tradition in his own way. Not because Anne demanded influence, but because she had repeatedly demonstrated that influence meant little unless exercised with restraint. That philosophy had become the foundation of her reputation. One advisor finally broke the silence by asking a carefully worded question. He wanted clarification. Would Princess Anne's guidance extend only to ceremonial coordination? Or would it also apply whenever questions emerged involving senior members of the royal family whose responsibilities occasionally overlapped? The room became quiet once again. Charles didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reopened the folder, turned slowly to one final page, and prepared to explain the single provision that many believed would define exactly how Princess Anne's new authority would affect Camilla in the years ahead. The room remained silent as King Charles turned to the final page. By now, nobody was questioning whether Princess Anne had been entrusted with a greater responsibility. That had already become clear. The only uncertainty concerned the limits of that responsibility. Inside every institution, authority is defined not only by what someone is allowed to do, but also by the situations in which that authority becomes necessary. Those boundaries determine whether a role is symbolic or genuinely influential. Charles looked around the table before speaking again. He explained that whenever questions involving coordination between senior working royals created uncertainty, the palace would require one clear point of guidance. Decisions affecting ceremonial responsibilities, official representation, and internal cooperation could no longer depend upon informal conversations or competing interpretations. The monarchy had entered a period where consistency mattered more than convenience. That sentence immediately shifted the discussion. Until now, the meeting had focused on responsibility. Now it focused on process. And process is often where real authority quietly reveals itself. One senior advisor leaned forward. Another stopped writing altogether. Even those who had spent decades inside royal administration understood that Charles was describing something larger than a simple redistribution of duties. He was describing a safeguard. Princess Anne listened without changing expression. She had witnessed enough constitutional discussions to recognise the careful language being used. The king wasn't granting personal influence. He was establishing institutional clarity. Those two ideas may sound similar, but inside Buckingham Palace, they are separated by an important principle. Personal influence depends upon relationships. Institutional authority depends upon trust. Charles wanted the second, not the first. He continued by explaining that future disagreements, however small they might appear publicly, could quickly grow into larger problems if responsibilities remained unclear. The monarchy had learned through experience that uncertainty often attracts speculation, and speculation can weaken public confidence, even when nothing significant has actually happened. That observation resonated throughout the room. For years, royal commentators had examined every public appearance, every seating arrangement, every ceremonial detail, searching for hidden meaning. Sometimes those interpretations reflected reality, often they did not. But Charles understood that clarity behind palace walls reduces confusion outside them. Prince William appeared to appreciate that point immediately. He had grown increasingly aware that modern monarchy functions under constant public observation. Every photograph, every procession, every official engagement is examined in extraordinary detail. Small misunderstandings can quickly become international headlines if internal responsibilities are not clearly understood beforehand. From William's perspective, today's discussion wasn't simply preparing the institution for present challenges. It was preparing it for future scrutiny. Camilla remained attentive. She followed every word carefully, understanding that discussions about coordination naturally affect every senior working royal. Yet Charles continued avoiding language that singled out any individual. Instead, he consistently emphasised the needs of the institution itself. That choice mattered, because institutions survive longest when decisions appear guided by principles rather than personalities. Then Charles reached the paragraph that had attracted so much attention among the advisors, reviewing the document earlier that morning. He explained that Princess Anne's guidance would become particularly important whenever ceremonial responsibilities involving senior members of the royal family required impartial coordination to ensure consistency with established royal practice. The wording remained careful, deliberately so. It didn't suggest supervision, it didn't imply personal judgment, it described coordination. Yet everyone in the room understood what coordination often requires. When different responsibilities intersect, someone must quietly determine how they fit together. Charles believed Anne was best suited for that role. One constitutional advisor finally spoke. He observed that such an arrangement would naturally require every senior household to cooperate closely whenever ceremonial questions arose. Charles nodded. He agreed without hesitation. Cooperation, he explained, had always been one of the monarchy's greatest strengths. But cooperation works best when everyone understands where guidance originates and why that guidance exists. Princess Anne finally spoke for the first time since the meeting had begun. Her words were remarkably brief. She simply acknowledged that any responsibility entrusted to her would be carried in service of the crown rather than personal preference. Nothing more, no lengthy acceptance, no emotional reflection, just one clear sentence. That response seemed to reassure everyone present, because it reflected exactly the reason Charles had placed such confidence in her. Anne wasn't interested in authority for its own sake. She understood authority only as another form of responsibility. Around the table, several advisors quietly relaxed. The atmosphere softened, not because the discussion had become less important, but because the person receiving that responsibility had demonstrated precisely the restraint everyone expected. Outside Buckingham Palace, journalists continued waiting for information that never arrived. Television crews speculated, royal experts debated. Social media filled with theories suggesting dramatic changes inside the royal family. Yet none of them knew that the most significant moment of the meeting hadn't involved applause, celebration, or constitutional reform. It had involved trust, quietly placed where Charles believed it belonged. The king slowly gathered the papers together before offering one final observation. He reminded everyone that history rarely remembers institutions for moments when everything runs smoothly. History remembers how institutions respond when difficult questions arise. That, he explained, was exactly why today's decision mattered. Not because it changed the monarchy overnight, but because it strengthened the framework through which future challenges would be managed. The meeting appeared to be approaching its conclusion. Officials began organising their notes. The palace secretary prepared the official record. Several advisors believed the most important decisions had already been made. But then, Charles reached beneath the folder and removed one final confidential memorandum that had not yet been discussed. The expression on Princess Anne's face remained calm. Prince William immediately looked toward the new document. Camilla quietly turned her attention back to the king, because whatever was written on those final pages seemed important enough to delay the meeting just a little longer. King Charles held the confidential memorandum for several seconds before opening it. Unlike the larger folder that had guided the meeting so far, this document was noticeably shorter. Yet the reaction it received was entirely different. Several senior advisors straightened in their chairs. The king's private secretary quietly placed his pen on the table. Even the constitutional experts, who had remained composed throughout the discussion, shifted their attention toward the final pages. That reaction mattered. Inside Buckingham Palace, the length of a document rarely determines its importance. Some of the most significant royal decisions are written in only a few carefully chosen paragraphs. What gives them weight is not the number of pages, but the authority behind every word. Charles unfolded the memorandum and spoke with the same measured tone that had guided the meeting from the beginning. He explained that responsibility only remains effective when everyone understands how it operates during moments of uncertainty. Procedures that seem unnecessary during calm periods often become indispensable when unexpected challenges arise. That, he said, was why today's discussion could not end with broad principles alone. The palace required practical guidance that every senior household could follow without hesitation. The room listened in complete silence. No one interrupted, because everyone understood they were now hearing the operational side of the king's decision. Charles continued by explaining that Princess Anne's role would not be defined by visibility, but by judgment. Her responsibility was never intended to replace existing offices or interfere with the established duties of senior members of the royal family. Instead, she would serve as the trusted figure whose experience could help preserve consistency whenever questions involving ceremonial responsibilities or institutional coordination became especially sensitive. That distinction was essential. Anne was not being asked to command. She was being asked to guide. Inside the monarchy, guidance often carries greater influence than authority exercised through public instruction. Princess Anne listened carefully before lowering her eyes toward the memorandum placed before her. Those closest to her had often remarked that Anne approached every responsibility the same way. She never measured a duty by the attention it might receive. She measured it by whether it strengthened the institution she had served throughout her entire life. That philosophy had earned her extraordinary respect, not because it attracted headlines, because it earned confidence. Prince William quietly studied the language being discussed. For the future king, the conversation carried lessons extending far beyond the present moment. Every monarchy survives by preparing the next generation before responsibility becomes unavoidable. William understood that Charles was not simply resolving today's administrative questions. He was demonstrating how stability should be preserved regardless of who eventually occupies the throne. Experience, Charles seemed to suggest, should never be wasted simply because history continues moving forward. One advisor asked whether Princess Anne's guidance would remain confidential unless official decisions required public explanation. The king answered immediately. Yes, most institutional discussions, he explained, would remain exactly where they belonged, inside the palace. Public statements would continue to describe official decisions, but the careful coordination supporting those decisions would remain private unless circumstances required otherwise. That answer reflected one of the monarchy's oldest traditions. The public often sees the outcome, rarely the process. And sometimes the process matters even more than the announcement itself. Camilla remained attentive throughout the exchange. Her composure never changed. Yet those observing closely noticed that she seemed especially interested in one point Charles continued emphasizing. Every responsibility entrusted to Princess Anne existed for one purpose alone: protecting the stability of the crown, Not personalities, not preferences, not private relationships. The institution. Charles repeated that principle several times. The repetition was deliberate, because he wanted nobody leaving the room believing today's decision had been motivated by personal opinion. It had been shaped by what he believed the monarchy would require in the years ahead. Outside Buckingham Palace, speculation continued growing. News organisations reported that an unusually lengthy meeting involving senior members of the royal family had finally concluded. Commentators debated what subjects might have required such extensive discussion. Some suggested preparations for future constitutional responsibilities. Others believed the palace was quietly reorganising internal operations to reflect changing demands upon the monarchy. Without official details, every theory remained exactly that, a theory. Inside the palace, however, the atmosphere had noticeably softened. The difficult questions had largely been answered. Officials began gathering their papers. Several advisors quietly exchanged observations before preparing to leave. It appeared the meeting had finally reached its conclusion. Then something unexpected happened. Before anyone stood from the table, King Charles carefully looked toward Princess Anne one final time. His expression was thoughtful, almost reflective. He acknowledged publicly what many inside the palace had believed for years, but had rarely heard spoken aloud. He said that reliability cannot be created by position alone. It is earned through decades of consistent service, disciplined judgment, and the willingness to place duty above personal recognition. No one in the room questioned who those words described. Princess Anne accepted them with the same quiet dignity that had defined the entire meeting. She offered no lengthy reply, only a respectful nod. Sometimes the strongest acceptance requires the fewest words. As the advisors prepared to leave, one final question emerged from the Constitutional Secretary. It concerned implementation. When would these responsibilities quietly begin influencing the day-to-day operation of the royal household? King Charles glanced once more at the confidential memorandum, closed it with deliberate care, and revealed that the answer depended upon an event already appearing on the royal calendar. An event where the public would notice nothing unusual, yet the palace would understand that everything had quietly changed. The meeting had officially ended, but inside Buckingham Palace, everyone understood that the real significance of King Charles's decision would never be measured by the words spoken around the conference table. It would be measured by the first moment those words quietly became reality. Throughout royal history, the monarchy has rarely announced institutional change with dramatic declarations. Instead, it allows important decisions to reveal themselves through protocol, ceremony, and carefully considered actions that appear ordinary to the public, but carry unmistakable meaning to those inside the palace. King Charles understood that tradition better than anyone. As the advisors left the room, he remained seated for a few moments, reviewing the notes that had been placed before him. The leather folder had now been closed, the confidential memorandum had been signed, and the official record of the meeting had already begun its journey into the palace archives. Yet Charles wasn't thinking about paperwork. He was thinking about the future. Because decisions involving responsibility are never truly tested on paper. They are tested when real situations demand judgment. Princess Anne quietly gathered her documents without saying a word. There was no celebration, no visible acknowledgement that anything extraordinary had happened. Anyone walking into the room at that moment would have seen nothing more than two siblings concluding another official meeting. But appearances inside royal life can be deeply misleading. The absence of visible emotion often signals the presence of enormous responsibility. Anne understood that better than almost anyone. For decades, she had carried out thousands of engagements with remarkable discipline, often becoming one of the busiest working members of the royal family, while receiving only a fraction of the public attention given to others. She had never built her reputation through speeches about duty. She had built it through duty itself. That distinction had quietly earned the confidence of 3 generations of palace officials. Prince William remained behind after most advisors departed. He exchanged a brief conversation with his father, not about personalities, but about continuity. According to those familiar with palace procedures, William has long believed that the greatest strength of the monarchy lies in its ability to prepare for tomorrow, long before tomorrow arrives. Charles appeared to share that philosophy completely. He reminded William that institutions survive when responsibility is entrusted to people whose decisions are respected, even during moments of disagreement. Public admiration can rise and fall with time, but confidence earned through decades of consistent service tends to remain remarkably stable. William listened carefully. He didn't challenge the reasoning. He didn't suggest alternatives. Instead, he appeared to recognise that today's decision represented something larger than one particular meeting. It represented the king's vision for how stability should continue during an era of constant public attention. Meanwhile, Camilla left the meeting with the same composure she had displayed throughout the afternoon. Nothing in her conduct suggested conflict. Nothing suggested confrontation. Yet she also understood that an important adjustment had quietly taken place inside the institution she had spent years helping to support. Charles had never described Princess Anne's expanded role as personal oversight. He had consistently framed it as institutional guidance. That language mattered enormously. Because guidance protects relationships, oversight can strain them. The king had deliberately chosen words that reinforced cooperation rather than competition. As evening settled over Buckingham Palace, preparations quietly began for the monarchy's next major public engagement. To most observers, it appeared entirely routine. Officials finalised schedules, protocol teams reviewed seating arrangements, military aides confirmed ceremonial timings. Household staff coordinated arrivals and departures with their usual precision. Everything appeared normal, but those who had attended the meeting knew something the rest of the palace did not. This would become the first occasion where Charles's new framework would quietly operate behind the scenes. No public announcement would accompany it. No press conference would explain it. The monarchy rarely works that way. Instead, subtle decisions would begin reflecting the principles established during the meeting. Princess Anne received several briefing folders later that evening. Each contained routine ceremonial information. Or at least they appeared routine. The engagements themselves were familiar. The schedules looked ordinary. Yet one important difference immediately stood out. Several coordination notes that had previously followed different administrative channels had now been directed through Anne's office for review before final confirmation. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't revolutionary, but inside palace administration, it represented the first practical sign that Charles's decision had already begun taking effect. Anne read every page carefully. She made only a handful of observations. No unnecessary revisions, no sweeping changes, only small recommendations designed to ensure consistency between different royal households. That approach perfectly reflected the confidence Charles had placed in her. She wasn't seeking to reshape the institution. She was helping it function more smoothly. Senior palace staff noticed the difference immediately. One official quietly remarked that Anne's comments focused almost entirely on clarity rather than authority. Another observed that her recommendations consistently removed unnecessary uncertainty before it could develop into larger questions. Neither observation reached the newspapers. Neither was intended to. Yet inside Buckingham Palace, those small details reinforced why Charles had chosen her. Not because she sought influence, because she reduced confusion. As preparations continued, one protocol officer approached the king's private secretary with an unexpected concern involving the upcoming engagement. Normally, such a question would have required several discussions between different palace officers before reaching a conclusion. This time, however, the response came almost immediately. The matter would first be referred to Princess Anne for guidance before the final recommendation reached the king. The official paused for a moment, then quietly nodded. The new process had already begun. No public announcement, no constitutional drama, simply a carefully organised system functioning exactly as Charles had intended. Late that evening, the king stood alone overlooking the palace gardens. The lights across London stretched into the distance, while the sounds of the city faded beneath the quiet of the palace grounds. He reflected not on today's meeting, but on tomorrow's responsibility. Because leadership is rarely defined by the decisions people applaud. It is defined by the decisions that continue protecting an institution long after public attention has moved elsewhere. Behind him, the palace corridors had grown almost silent. The documents had been filed. The advisors had gone home. Princess Anne had already begun reviewing the next day's responsibilities. Everything appeared settled. Then, the king's private secretary returned carrying an urgent message connected to the very first engagement that would test the new arrangement. Charles opened the note, read only a few lines, and his expression changed immediately, because something unexpected had happened before the new system had even completed its first day. King Charles accepted the note without saying a word. The room had almost emptied, yet the urgency in the king's private secretary's expression immediately changed the atmosphere once again. Moments earlier, the meeting had appeared complete. The framework had been approved. The responsibilities had been clarified. Princess Anne had quietly accepted the role entrusted to her. But institutions are rarely tested when everything unfolds according to plan. They are tested when the unexpected arrives before anyone has time to prepare. Charles unfolded the message. He read it once, then he read it again. The paper itself contained no dramatic language. It didn't describe a crisis or an emergency. Instead, it referred to a last-minute protocol question concerning the next major royal engagement. Several ceremonial arrangements required immediate clarification because responsibilities between different palace officers appeared to overlap. To an outsider, the issue might have seemed insignificant. Inside Buckingham Palace, it represented something much larger. The king's new system was about to face its first real test. Charles slowly looked toward Princess Anne. He didn't explain the entire note. He simply slid the paper across the polished table, without instruction, without explanation. That single gesture carried extraordinary meaning. Only hours earlier, Charles had explained that difficult questions requiring institutional judgment should first reach Princess Anne before returning to him. Now, without saying a single word, he was following the very principle he had established. Leadership inside the monarchy has always depended upon example. Rules mean very little if the sovereign himself refuses to follow them. Anne quietly picked up the memorandum. She read every line carefully. No one interrupted her. No advisor offered an opinion. No official attempted to influence the discussion. For several moments, the room became completely silent. The decision belonged to Anne, not because she possessed greater rank, but because Charles had entrusted her judgment. That distinction mattered more than any title. Anne finally lowered the document. She asked only 2 brief questions. Both concerned procedure. Neither concerned personalities. She wanted to know which household had received the original instruction. She wanted to know whether existing royal protocol already provided an answer. Those questions immediately impressed the constitutional advisors. Anne wasn't searching for authority. She was searching for consistency. That difference explained why Charles had placed such confidence in her. Great institutions survive because their strongest leaders rarely ask who benefits. They ask what protects the institution itself. After reviewing the relevant protocol guidance, Anne quietly explained her recommendation. She suggested following the established ceremonial precedent, rather than creating an entirely new arrangement. The reasoning was remarkably simple. Whenever long-standing procedures already exist, changing them without necessity creates unnecessary uncertainty. Charles listened carefully. Then he smiled. It wasn't a broad smile. It was the quiet expression of someone whose confidence had just been confirmed. He accepted Anne's recommendation immediately. No debate followed. No further discussion proved necessary. The issue had been resolved exactly as Charles had hoped it would be. Calmly, professionally, without emotion overshadowing judgment. Several advisors later remarked that the exchange lasted less than 10 minutes. Yet those 10 minutes quietly demonstrated everything the king had hoped to achieve. Princess Anne had not imposed authority. She had provided clarity, and clarity had restored certainty before uncertainty could spread. Outside Buckingham Palace, the public remained completely unaware of what had just taken place. Television broadcasts continued discussing possible future changes inside the royal family. Newspapers prepared headlines based largely upon speculation. Social media continued producing countless theories about hidden palace developments. Ironically, the most important moment of the entire day would never appear in any official statement. Because the monarchy rarely measures success by what becomes public. It measures success by the problems the public never sees. As evening settled across London, Charles remained alone inside his study. The documents from the meeting rested neatly upon his desk. He looked toward a portrait of Queen Elizabeth II hanging quietly on the wall. For a long moment, he said nothing. Perhaps because he understood that every monarch eventually reaches the same realization. No sovereign governs entirely alone. Every reign depends upon trusted people willing to place duty before recognition. Queen Elizabeth had relied upon steady judgment throughout her historic reign. Now Charles had chosen to strengthen his own reign in much the same way. Not through dramatic reform, not through public declarations, but through quiet confidence in someone who had already spent a lifetime proving herself. Princess Anne returned to her office without celebration. She didn't speak to reporters. She didn't issue a statement. She didn't seek acknowledgement for the responsibility she had quietly accepted. Instead, she reviewed the next day's schedule exactly as she always had. To Anne, duty had never been measured by attention. It had always been measured by consistency. Camilla also continued with her responsibilities exactly as expected. Nothing about the king's decision changed her constitutional position, her public role, or her commitment to supporting the monarchy. Yet the meeting had quietly established something important. Whenever difficult institutional questions emerged in the future, Charles wanted experience, discipline, and steady judgment guiding the conversation before conclusions were reached. For him, Princess Anne represented those qualities more consistently than anyone else. Whether future historians will remember this meeting as an important administrative milestone remains impossible to know. What can be said is far simpler. King Charles chose not to strengthen the monarchy through louder speeches or greater ceremony. He chose to strengthen it through trust. And perhaps that became the real story all along, not a story about one royal standing above another, not a story about winners or losers, but a story about how enduring institutions often depend upon the quietest people in the room. Because sometimes the greatest authority isn't the person who speaks the most, it's the person everyone trusts when the room falls silent. And in that silence, King Charles made one thing unmistakably clear. For every difficult decision that lay ahead, he believed Princess Anne's greatest qualification wasn't ambition.